الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق الناصر بالحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره مقدار العظيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق الناصر بالحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره مقدار العظيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق الناصر بالحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره مقدار العظيم. سبحان ربك بالعزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Brothers and sisters in Islam and in Iman and in Ihsan, in beautification and excellence, it is my pleasure to be here with you this evening and with Beacon. May Allah Azza wa Jal bless all of those who are involved in Beacon, and also bless the household that is hosting us this evening, and the refreshments and hospitality. And may Allah Azza wa Jal make this to be an opening of khair for this family in Ihsan. And may Allah Azza wa Jal protect them and protect all of those who they love. Ameen. I'm here with my brother, my soul brother, Dr. Bilal Ware, esteemed brother, tenured professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And before we start this conversation, I just want to say something relating to how I met him and how we as Muslims, we can study certain things in our tradition scholastically and through a teacher. And then when we have experiences or when we come across certain individuals in our life, that we get velk, or we get to really taste that which we learn from our teachers. And there's a hadith that is sahih. And I'm saying this because it's not some random hadith. That our beloved Prophet ﷺ said, that spirits or legionnaires are like troops in the army. Then the rest of the hadith is فَمَا تَعَرَّفَ مِنْهَا أَتَلَفَ. And those spirits that know each other, they are brought together. They're brought to closer proximity. وَمَا تَنَكَرَ مِنْهَا أَخْتَلَفَ. And those who don't like each other, those spirits who find themselves each other repugnant, they're going to disagree and or they're going to separate. So the first time I met Sidi Bilal, we were at an event for a great Sufi sheikh of West Africa, is Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba. It was a gathering at the Tawheed Center in Farmington Hills. And I met Sidi Bilal. He sat next to me my first time meeting him. This rapper, Dr. Jackson, had just left, and he had got settled at the University of Michigan. And we began to talk, and I knew from that moment that I met Dr. Bilal that we were going to be together. I knew from that moment we were going to be together. I didn't see him for an entire year, basically almost since that gathering, and we came across each other that time, and we've been together ever since at events, visiting each other, and we even traveled overseas for a rihla, or a spiritual journey, a couple of months ago to Senegal. So this brother right here means a lot to me. Ali ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, said that that there are many brothers. There are many brothers which your mother did not give birth to. Ali ibn Abi Talib said there are many brothers, and that also means sisters too. There's an akh, we can say ukh, we can say, but the saying of Ali says akh. There are many brothers that were not given birth to by your mother, and so this is my brother from another mother right here, Dr. Ware. And with that, before we get to the conversation, I'd like Dr. Ware very briefly to tell us a little something about himself for those of you who don't know him. And especially, I think, it's important for you to understand a man of his character and his stature to really know what led him to Islam, but then what led him to have a spiritual rebirth or a rejuvenation of Islam through his years of study in Senegal. So with that, CD.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. One more time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. So warm welcome on a cold night. It's a good salam. Thank you for that. Alhamdulillah. I'll just repeat Imam Dawud's thanks to Beacon and to Brother Adil and his family for hosting this event. May Allah put light in this event and put light in his home. And I want to thank Imam Dawud for the kind introduction. Who knew that it was Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala an that gave us the term brother from another mother? You learn something new every day, mashallah. And if you've had the chance to look at Imam Dawud's book, Centering Black Narrative, that's about people of color, people of dark skin color in early Islam, you'll know that Ali ibn Abi Talib was described using the same color terminology as Bilal. He was described as dark brown. So perhaps it's not surprising that he gave us the expression brother from another mother. MashaAllah. And I want to thank each and every person who left their home to come here this evening. In the hopes of finding some knowledge and some benefit. And indeed, I left my home this evening in hopes of finding knowledge and benefit, and I for sure already found benefit. So alhamdulillah. Imam Dawud asked me to say a few words about myself, which is something that I don't particularly like to do. But when the Imam asks you, you do as you're told. I came to Islam when I was 15 years old, having spent my early teenage years in search of truth, in search of Allah, though I didn't know that name at the time. And my path was made easy and fast by my encountering the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was 15. I had just turned 15. I read that book from cover to cover in one night. And then I went to my public school that I was in high school at, and I checked out an English translation of the Quran. Because the spiritual journey that I found described by El-Hajj Malik Shabazz in that book, may Allah be well pleased with him.
Ameen.
Confirmed the truth that I had known about God since I was a small child, that God was one and indivisible. So I read the English translation of the Quran the next night. I went 2 nights without sleeping. And then I fell asleep and missed my school bus and didn't go to school the next day. And then I went to my mother and told her that I'm a Muslim. And I made arrangements to go to a Muslim center at a predominantly immigrant mosque in the suburbs of Minneapolis in 1989. And I took Shahada there. And Allah Himself guided me to the religion, but I'll be honest, when I started interacting with Muslims, they pushed me away. One of the things that had deeply motivated my conversion was Malcolm's description of the unity of humanity that he saw when he made his pilgrimage. And I experienced something quite different from most immigrant Muslims when I converted to Islam at the age of 15. I had gone to, I had been bused to a private school for 5th and 6th grade where I was the only black student in the school. And I was called nigger to my face 4 or 5 times a week, pretty much from the entirety of my experience there. That was just what I heard. But to be truthful, I found many of the Muslims that I encountered to be just as racist as the white people that I had fled from. And it was deeply painful. And part of the reason why we're here to have this discussion tonight is to talk about the marginalization that African Americans experience within this religion, and also the marginalization that Africans experience within this religion. And as somebody who eventually went on to go study in Senegal, I studied in Senegal as an undergraduate for the first time when I was 22 years old in 1996. And it was there that I actually saw Islam practiced in a safe and healthy way. And that started to restore a lot of the damage that had been done to my heart from the experiences that I had had with the American Muslim community. I'll just be blunt about that. And Imam Dawud might not remember this, but I told him at that first meeting that American Islam was none of my business. That American Islam had almost cost me my Islam and African Islam had saved it. So that my responsibility was to serve people like the community of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, to serve the community of the Tijani community, to serve the people who had taught me what it meant to know Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and to have love in my heart for his messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam. And yet, in spite of myself, thanks to the encouragement and guidance of wise brothers like Imam Dawud, I've become persuaded of the absolute necessity of awakening the American Muslim community to the contributions of Africans to Islam so that I can share some of the good that was given to me, some of the healing that was given to me, and some of the light that's been given to me over the course of 20 years of going and coming from West Africa. I've spent about 3.5 years of my life total living in West Africa. I learned to speak French, which is the official language of Senegal, and also to speak the Wolof language, which is the vernacular language of Senegal. And everything that I know of benefit in this religion was taught to me by sheikhs in Senegal that I sat with during my time that was there. So anything good in tonight's discussion comes from them, and the mistakes come from me.
I want to double click on something that you mentioned. Sister Irma actually started off making a reference to this, where she said about everyone's lineage relating to Islam in America, even if you're not from African descent. And I'd like for you to kind of put a little exclamation point on that, on why is the history of Islam in Africa, West Africa in particular, and how it relates to you and myself and the descendants of those enslaved Muslims. What is the spiritual, but also the social? Why should it matter spiritually, but also socially, politically, for Muslims who are not from African background?
Yeah, I mean, everyone in this room is aware of the war that's being waged on Islam presently. And Islam is being painted into a corner as an alien immigrant religion, something that is foreign to the American way and foreign to American traditions. And we, as immigrant Muslims, in ignoring the African contributions to Islam, we participate in our own marginalization as American Muslims. Because the fact of the matter is that African Muslims were brought to what became the United States of America before it was the United States of America. African Muslims came to the Western Hemisphere, are documented in the Western Hemisphere as early as 1507. African Muslims are celebrating the two Eids and praying publicly in Mexico in the 15 teens and 1520s. They're present in Brazil, they're present in all of the Caribbean islands, and they're present in the colonies of South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. The total volume of the Atlantic slave trade brings something between 12 and 20 million Africans to these shores. And Muslims represent 10 to 15% of the total volume of that Atlantic slave trade, which makes African Muslims larger than any ethnic group of Africans that are involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Muslims come here by the millions. And as long as we don't claim that original priority that Muslims have lived and died and sanctified America, then we are going to be brushed aside. We are going to be dismissed. And those are stories that we have to be able to tell. Imam Dawud mentioned that we would talk about this as a topic, and I printed out something not from my first book, from the Walking Quran, but from a book that I'm writing now that's about enslaved Muslims from West Africa and the Americas. And I just want you to read this for a taste of what I'm describing. This is from a book written by an Episcopalian priest in the 1840s. It was called Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. He was a man who wanted sincerely to convert African Americans to Christianity, and he considered that the way that the Bible was used against black people kept black people from accepting Christianity, which is obvious. If you've seen Birth of a Nation and watched Nat Turner try to preach the way that the white people wanted the Bible used, you know the truth in this man's position. So he tells a story about a man who was sold in the city of Savannah in 1806. And he tells the story of the man who purchased him. And you'll understand the significance of this by the time I get to the end. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, J. Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single as suited the purchasers, a middle-aged man was put up upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Mohammedan, and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties came, he must have time to attend to them. Mr. D, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself that he would soon convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required, and in addition should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism, and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Jesus Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after them. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that. The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and at an advanced age died, declaring that God was one God and Muhammad was his prophet. Black people brought Islam to these shores under the most difficult of circumstances. And we dishonor their sacrifice when we ignore their descendants. I gave a khutbah at the University of Michigan last summer when black men were being gunned down in the street every week. And I told the students, who are predominantly of Desi and Arab background, that there's a day coming when you'll want my people standing next to you. And if you want us standing next to you on that day, stand for us today. Know that if you do not stand with the Beni Israel of this country, the oppressed and enslaved of this country, then you can prepare yourself to be counted amongst the people of Pharaoh. Allah has forbidden oppression upon himself, and he always answers the prayer of the oppressed against the oppressor. So if you are not actively helping the oppressed, then you are amongst the oppressors. And if you think that just saying La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah will save you on the last day when the injustices are being reckoned, don't be so sure. We have a tremendous and extraordinary opportunity in this country. We have, in spite of all the oppression and in spite of the difficulty, we have Muslims of every single ethnic and national background, all living together in a state where no specific interpretation of Islam is in a position of political authority, so therefore all sects have more or less equal access to Islam. That's something that hasn't existed anywhere in the Muslim world probably for 7 centuries, probably since the fall of Baghdad. And we're squandering this opportunity. We're squandering this opportunity because we stay closed in our own ethnic communities. We associate with people that are like us, and we don't make an effort to learn about the history, the past, and the culture of other communities. And especially in this country, that has to mean learning about African American Islam, and it has to therefore mean learning about African Islam, because that's the tree. That's the tree that left the seeds of Islam in this place. And there's a lot that I can tell you about African Islam. I'll let Imam Dawud guide us.
Thank you. I would say too that, and as I go to the next question, and he mentioned his book, Dr. Ware's book, The Walking Quran. I strongly suggest all of you, before Black History Month is over, to buy that book, The Walking Quran, and you can go on Amazon.com and look up that book written by Dr. Ware, The Walking Quran. Now, you mentioned in your comments about how our ancestors, our Muslim ancestors, were brought here in the millions via the so-called transatlantic slave trade. It really wasn't a trade, it was really a demonic enterprise that took place. But you've talked about this and written about this as well, that there are individuals in the status quo of America on the right who smear Muslims, as well as the Black Orientalists, as Dr. Jackson talks about, who tries to say that why should African Americans be involved in the religion of Islam when basically you've traded one slave master for another, since the Arabs were involved in the so-called Arab or so-called Muslim slave trade of African people, which preceded the so-called transatlantic slave trade. Can you give us some points on how that is a very ill-informed and not intellectually honest framed parallel, and also point the difference to us? What was the difference between the so-called Muslim slave trade in East Africa in comparison to what the white slave masters did in West Africa?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's also part of the reason why I read what I read, because that's so. For a longer version of this, read chapter 3 of the Walking Quran, and also read the chapter that I wrote for the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 3, on the period between 1400 and 1800, because I go into a great deal of detail, and you can read the footnotes and you can understand where the research comes from to demonstrate this. And if you're not big into reading academic books, there's also an interview that I did at the Schomburg Public Library with Sylviane Juth, the author of Servants of Allah, where I talked about this for about an hour, and we won't talk about it for an hour tonight. But those are a couple places that you can go for more detail. As far as what I can say with the limited time that we have here, that man that was being sold on that Savannah dock that day in 1806 was convinced that the religion of Islam didn't allow a Muslim to own another Muslim in perpetuity and their children after that. And his interpretation was being informed by the fact that he came out of a revolutionary tradition in West Africa that had been struggling against the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery itself for more than 150 years. Part of the problem that comes with ignoring African history in the study of Islam is that we end up ignoring important parts of human liberation struggles that were led and guided by African Muslim intellectuals. And we're leaving out a huge branch of the Muslim family when we do so. Before I get to the part about slavery, so it's important to understand how central Islam has been to African history to begin with. 1 in 6 of the world's Muslims lives in sub-Saharan Africa. There are more than 300 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa. There are more than twice as many Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa as there are in North Africa. But nobody in this room thought that before they came here. Everybody associates Islam with the North Africa, when you think about Africa, or with the Middle East. There are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt. There are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. There's a higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than there is in Syria. But we don't pay attention to African Islam because we do have unaddressed histories of racism within our own communities. We have color complexes within our own communities. Many countries in the Muslim world, sadly, but truthfully, have histories of the enslavement of Africans. So that prejudices against black people exist in our countries of origin, and then we come to America and all hell breaks loose because it's compiling, racism on top of racism. So we don't pay attention to Africa, and we don't think much of African Muslims when we think of the story of Islam. But we do so at great intellectual risk because we miss the stories like the story of that man on the Savannah docks. So I write in chapter 3 of the Walking Quran, which is the chapter is called The Book in Chains, and it's about struggles against the enslavement of Muslims in West Africa. And the centerpiece of that chapter tells the story of an anti-slavery revolution that starts in the 1770s in Senegal, that is the first modern state to abolish the institution of slavery anywhere in the world. They do this before the creation for the London Society for the Abolition of Slavery. In fact, the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, who is the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of Slavery, writes about these African Muslim revolutionaries and uses them to try to shame the kings of Europe into abolishing the slave trade. And you never heard that before you came in here, because we've been told that it was Christian do-gooders that brought about the abolition of the slave trade, and that Muslims are terminally committed to the institution of slavery because the Quran mentions it as a fact of human existence, which it was during the time of the revelation of the Quran. So this revolutionary movement in the Senegal River Valley used the following mechanism to try to free every enslaved person within this state. And I call it a state because it's not a kingdom. Not only is this an anti-slavery revolution, it's a republican revolution because they also abolished monarchy. 18 years before the French Revolution is going to do the same thing. 7 years before the American Revolution is going to do the same thing. And you've never heard this story. So it's a Republican revolution, it's an anti-slavery revolution. But because it's black Muslims that are guiding it, you've never heard of it. But the abolitionists of the time, like the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, who was, as I mentioned, the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of Slavery, he knew all about it. His first publication that he wrote urging Europeans to abolish the slave trade, he devoted 20% of the book to the discussion of these African Muslim revolutionaries from the Senegal River Valley. And he said of the imam of their movement, a person called Abdul Qadir Khan, he said, the wise and virtuous imam is to be more respected than any of the sovereigns of Europe, because he has made far greater contributions than they to the causes of liberty, justice, humanity, and religion. That's an Anglican priest in the 1780s praising an African Muslim for doing what the sovereigns of Europe don't have the nerve to do, which is to acknowledge the dignity of human beings and try to set everyone free. Here's how Abdul Qadir Khan does it. in spite of the fact that most legal scholars throughout the history of Islam did interpret slavery as being a legal institution under Islam. The reason why the chapter is called The Book in Chains is that for people like Abdul Qadir Khan, any person who recited any part of the Quran couldn't be held in bondage, was not fit for slavery. He offered freedom to anyone who would recite a single ayah of the Quran. No part of the book of God should be subjugated by another human being. That was his interpretation. And if you read the piece that I wrote for the Cambridge World History of Slavery, you'll find that while he was an extreme example, someone that was forward-thinking and revolutionary, he was not isolated. There have always been Muslim scholars who argued against the institution of slavery, just as there have always been Muslim scholars who, for financial and political reasons, argued for it. But the one that's frequently mentioned by the West African scholars was Sayyidina Umar, radiallahu anhu, who famously, in the foundational battles in early Islam, anytime he saw any of the captives amongst the enslaved praying, he would set them free. And he was told, Amir al-Mu'mineen, don't you know that they're just deceiving you, so they just set them free? He said, better to be deceived by the one that deceives you in favor of God than to keep in bondage the one who makes the salah. Now, that gets forgotten when the Bani Umayyah begin conquest to establish a worldly caliphate. And let's just be blunt about the fact that these are the descendants of the people who tried to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ during his life. Just be blunt about that. And so slavery does get written into what comes to be Islamic law, but there are always dissenting opinions. And there is a long history of emancipatory uses of Islam and Islamic institutions to try to free human beings, but you haven't heard of them, in large part because we've been told a lie about Islam. The Orientalists have been in collusion with the Black Orientalists. The far right says absurd things, about the relationship between slavery and Islam. But the main reason why why we persist in this ignorance and delusion is because we do ignore Black people. And so therefore we're not studying African history, we're not learning about what was being done in Senegal in the 1770s, 1780s, right? We don't hear the stories about Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, for example, who was another one of these scholars who in his case in the 19th century, also struggled against the problem of enslavement as it had spread, in West Africa. There was once a man who came to make bay'ah to him, and he offered him the gift of a slave in order to like as a gesture. And Ahmadou Bamba said to him, he said, "You own him?" The man said, "Yeah." And he said to him, "Soko mome yamamom ndachmag mom yo boko borom," which means, if you own him, then you own me, because he and I have the same master. So that is a thread that has run through the thinking of many West African scholars with respect to the question of slavery. And until we recover and resuscitate those stories of African Muslims who were emancipatory and liberatory thinkers, we're going to be stuck with this fiction that white people taught the world what freedom was. And as long as we submit on that point, we have no leg to stand on in the 21st century. We're going to continue to be battered as though our tradition is conservative and reactionary and has contributed nothing to the causes of liberty, humanity, justice, and religion, the way that the Reverend Thomas Clarkson said it did. So I'm working on a book now that's called The First Atlantic Revolution, Islam, Abolition, and Republic, circa 1776. And it's about this revolutionary movement that abolishes kingship as well as slavery. And that's just me working as one historian. and I've had to dig that story out of the archives piece by piece. I need help. You know, like we need to be engaged in an effort to bring the contributions of black Muslims to life. Whether in West Africa in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, or to bring the stories of black Muslims in amongst the early pious Muslims, amongst the community of the Sahaba, back to the forefront, so that we don't give in to these fake stories that portray Islam as always a religion of slavery, as always a religion of ignoring black people, just because we ignore black people today.
I'm going to ask you one last question, and we can open it up to the brothers and sisters, inshallah. But in December, you led a delegation of a number of imams and leaders, Sheikh Mohammed Mindis, Ustad Aisha Prime, Sidi Kamal Ayubi, number. I was blessed to be a part of the group that you led as well.
Nisa Muhammad,
yes,
Muslim chaplain at Howard University.
And so we spent 10 beautiful days in Senegal and in Dakar, and then we did Mawlid Nabawi and in Kaulach, Medina Bay, then we went to the blessed city of Touba. And I want you just to share a little bit of your thoughts about your last trip to Senegal, but in particular that you were able to lead a group of people of like minds and like souls from here that are so much involved in trying to do the dawah and really spread humanity and bring Muslims together as far as unity. And of course, and by the way, all of the Muslims that were there weren't black either. Abbas Darab is Afghani background. Ali Hussein is Arab. His wife is Turkish, so it just wasn't an all black delegation. For clarification, but
maybe 2/3 black.
Yeah, it was 2/3 black.
Alhamdulillah. The first thing that I should say about that is what allowed us and financed the trip, which is a research initiative that I direct at the University of Michigan called Ikhlas. And Ikhlas is a research initiative, it's an acronym, for the study of Islamic knowledge, histories and languages, arts and sciences. So it's strictly for the study of the traditional ulum ad-din, whether from a historical, Islamic studies, anthropological, political science, interdisciplinary in an academic way. But the most important thing about Ikhlas is that all Ikhlas events include community-based scholars as well as academics, as well as classically trained scholars. So, and it's something that the International Institute at the University of Michigan gave me the mandate to found, and Ikhlas needs your help and support because it's allowed us to have amazing speakers like Imam Fode Drame, who's been to the community a number of times. We've held conferences attended by as many as 400 and 500 people at the university. So check out Ikhlas's website, and if there's something that you can do to help us continue this work, please do so. So Ikhlas allowed us to take this trip, and I'll just tell you my favorite part of the trip. I don't know if you know what my favorite part of the trip is. It wasn't the Mawlid and Nabi, although that was lovely. It was amazing. But I've been in Senegal for Mawlid before, and it wasn't the opening ceremony in Dakar, in spite of the fact that my favorite Qasida reciter recited my favorite poem of Ahmadou Bamba at the opening ceremony, and that poem was the thing that I read at the first Beacon event that I attended.
Abdoulaye Seck.
Yeah, Abdoulaye Seck. Yeah, Abdoulaye Seck. He does an amazing recitation of Ahmadou Bamba's poetry. And I translated one of Ahmadou Bamba's poems, and now I'm working on several others, into verse in English so that you can read them as poems. They rhyme. So that was also a highlight, but it wasn't the highlight. Neither was the closing ceremony in Touba, where it was probably 500 or 600 people that came out for that event. And that, by the way, that talk and the poetry reading now has, I think, 17,000 hits on YouTube that day, because it got a big response in Senegal. There was a very positive response to our presence there, for sure.
Yeah.
The highlight of the trip for me, though, was none of those things. The highlight of the trip for me was the trip that we made to Goree Island.
I knew you were going to say that.
Before the conference started. Because Goree Island is one of the places where there is an 18th and 19th century slave fort that's preserved and is now a museum for the history of the slave trade. And because I lived in Senegal for a long time, and because I speak Wolof and French, every time anybody came to visit, I would have to guide them to Goree. And it's really hard for me to go to that place because you see holding cells that are literally like about the size of that fireplace opening, where 2 or 3 men who were thought to be, conspiring to flee or to rebel would be put inside a small space like that and put behind iron bars for days at a time. You see the door of no return, where people are walked out on a plank to canoes that are going to take them to ships that are going to take them to a lifetime of toil and suffering. And you see the place where people jumped off of those planks and jumped out of those canoes and drowned themselves in the Atlantic because they just couldn't bear giving up everything. So it's a very painful experience for me each time that I go. And I don't like going, I'll just be honest. I went because you guys hadn't been. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I've never been to that place without crying. And I cried that day. But after we had visited the museum, so while I was sobbing, Imam Dawud and Ali Hussein and our multi-ethnic polyglot group of academics and imams, they were making dhikr on the spot that the people had been taken away. They were singing qasa'id on the spot where the suffering of so many began. And the suffering, it's worth mentioning, the suffering is no more real and no more significant for those that were Muslim than for the ones that weren't. Standing with the black people is not just about standing with the Muslims amongst the black people. It's about standing with the oppressed against the oppressors, period, in every situation. So when they had finished making their dhikr, we went to the top of the hill on Goree, and the sun had set. And those of us that needed to make ablutions made ablutions with water on the top of that hill. And overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, we prayed Maghrib with an African-American brother from New Orleans, Joshua Martin, making the adhan. And then Muhammad Mendez, an African-American brother from Atlanta, leading the prayer. And then me making the dua after the prayer. And that was my favorite part of the trip. Because it brought closure and peace into that space. The same way that having my daughter, my wife and I, our daughter born in Senegal in 2001, after hundreds of years of not having any from our lineage born back in Africa, it brought closure and peace. And we have, as American Muslims, the opportunity to bring closure and peace. We have the opportunity to go back to the foundations of our religion, to go back to the great contributions of African Muslims, not just to African history, but to the history of this country. Frederick Douglass, it's worth mentioning, is very likely the descendant of Muslims from the Sea Islands. And he's the one who brought the first warning to this country. his father was a white man, but his maternal kin were all named Bailey. And there are no white Baileys in the Sea Islands for him to take the name Bailey from. But there were lots of Bilalis in the Sea Islands. And Bilali often gets anglicized as Bailey.
Yeah.
Muslims are hiding in plain sight in American history all the time. Read, Michael Gomez's, Black Crescent. Read Exchanging Our Country Marks, also by Gomez, and you'll find that oftentimes there's things in African American culture that you won't know originally came from Islam, because African Americans don't even know that certain cultural elements that are just part of who we are come from Islamic sources. So we have an opportunity to bring closure, back to that. And in doing so, we have an opportunity to state our claim to freedom in this place. And the storm clouds are gathering. I was telling one of the brothers before we started the talk, and then after this we can go to questions, that the Prophet ﷺ, he's reported to have said that all of the inhabitants of the graves long for the same thing, which is a day in which they could accomplish some good that would be a benefit to their souls where they are now. And the first time that I heard that, I think I was like 17 or 18. And the first thing that I thought was, man, I have what every human being who has ever lived or died would give up everything that they've ever owned to have. I have today. What I'm going to do with it? What am I going to do with today? So I ask you the same question that I asked myself, then. Like, what are we going to do today?
I'm going to make one comment just from what you said, because I told you we're soul brothers. That actually was the most powerful part of my trip too, was the Goree Island, when we caught the ferry out there.
Yeah.
And when we went and we did dhikr by the Atlantic Ocean at the so-called door of no return.
Yeah, we returned after all.
Yeah, I walked out crying, but the Senegalese brother who stayed with us was a Baifal brother. I came out and he said to me, I think I told you this, but he said to me, they call us the door of no return, but what those slave masters didn't know is that you would be back. And he said, Alhamdulillah, the children of Islam are back. And I remember when he said that, I literally just broke down and started crying. I think I came and hugged you at the time.
Did, I remember.
It was like he said they didn't think that you would make it back. He says, but you're here. And the same thing at Tuba at the conference, when you and Sheikh Mendez got up with Abdullah II, you were doing the qasida. And I remember the brother said the same thing. Like, the Senegalese people were so overjoyed to see us, and they were like, the children of Islam are back, they're here. And people's smiles were like, they were brighter than the sun that day. It's hard to describe, but for me, that experience was a real, it was a healing for me. And I've spent time in Mali a couple of times, and of course I've made Hajj a couple of times. Alhamdulillah for those experiences, but that one day at that one moment just reconciled and closed so much hurt that I had inside of me, as far as what our people have gone through. So alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, we were able to make that trip. Do you have any questions for Dr. Ware or for myself?
Or for Imam Dawud.